A routine walk turns into a nightmare. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the quiet neighborhood in a warm glow as James Holloway adjusted his glasses and stepped onto the familiar sidewalk. At 68 years old, he had developed a daily ritual, an evening stroll to Wilson's Corner Store, a place where he would pick up a newspaper, sometimes a pint of ice cream for his grandkids, and exchange pleasantries with longtime neighbors. It was a simple routine, but one that provided a sense of peace in a world that had once been filled with financial audits, forensic accounting, and corruption cases that often placed him in the crosshairs of powerful people. James was no ordinary retiree. For over 4 decades, he had been a forensic accountant, exposing financial fraud at the highest levels. His meticulous records had uncovered millions in missing taxpayer dollars, police pension scandals, and corruption rings that stretched all the way up to City Hall. He had made enemies, powerful ones, but he had never been afraid, not when he had the truth on his side. As he approached Wilson's, he paused at a familiar sight, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow, tending to her flower garden. "Evening, Mrs. Patterson," he greeted with a smile. She looked up from her petunias, her face creased with concern. "James, dear, I saw those police officers parked down the street again. They'd been sitting there all afternoon." James followed her gaze to a black and white patrol car idling near the curb. He recognized Officer Brian Carter, a young officer with a reputation for unnecessary aggression, and Officer Derek Mitchell, a fresh recruit who seemed uncomfortable with the company he kept. James sighed. This wasn't the first time they had loitered around his neighborhood. He had noticed an increase in random patrols near his home ever since he had testified in a financial fraud case involving the police union's pension fund. He knew intimidation tactics when he saw them. "Don't worry about me, Mrs. Patterson," James reassured her. "I've dealt with worse." But as he stepped into Wilson's store, he had no idea that tonight would be different. A suspicious man in a neighborhood store. Inside the small corner store, Tom Wilson, the owner, gave James a nod. "Evening, Mr. Holloway. Usual paper." James nodded but paused when he noticed 2 teenage boys browsing the snack aisle. The new store clerk, a nervous-looking young man, was watching them like a hawk, hovering nearby, his fingers twitching near his pocket as if contemplating calling the police. James observed the situation carefully. The boys, both black, no older than 16 or 17, were just looking at chips and sodas. They weren't causing trouble, weren't being disruptive. Yet the clerk's suspicion was written all over his face. "Can I help you find something?" the clerk asked sharply. "We're just looking," one of the boys responded hesitantly. James knew where this was heading. He had seen it before, unspoken discrimination disguised as store policy. The taller teen picked up an energy drink and placed it on the counter. "ID," the clerk demanded immediately. The teen frowned. "For a soda?" "Store policy," the clerk said flatly. James felt his blood pressure rise. He had been coming to this store for years, and no such policy had ever existed. This store never had an ID policy for energy drinks. James spoke calmly, stepping forward. The clerk's expression tightened. "This doesn't concern you." James met his gaze evenly. "It does when I see young men being singled out unfairly." The clerk's face turned red with frustration. "I don't have to explain myself to you. If you have a problem with how I run my store, you can take it up with the owner." "I think I will," James replied smoothly. "In the meantime, I suggest you let these young men make their purchase like any other customer." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Reluctantly, the clerk rang up the purchases, but as the boys took their change, the store's door swung open, and in walked Officers Carter and Mitchell. "The setup begins." James immediately tensed. The officers' timing was too perfect. They had been waiting. Carter's gaze flicked to the clerk, then to James. "Everything all right here?" The clerk hesitated for a second, then quickly pointed. "Yeah, that guy." He gestured toward James. "He's been causing trouble, making the scene." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Carter smirked and turned to James. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance. I'm gonna need to see some ID." James exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "On what grounds?" "You match the description of someone causing trouble in this store," Carter said, crossing his arms. "Which is?" James asked, keeping his voice steady. "Agitating customers. Harassing staff." James folded his arms. "I was correcting an unfair situation. That's not a crime." Carter stepped closer, his voice dripping with authority. "Sir, I need you to show ID. Now." James had spent his life fighting financial criminals, corrupt officials, and abuses of power. He knew the pattern. This wasn't about a store policy. It was about intimidation. "I know my rights," James said firmly. "Unless I'm being detained for reasonable suspicion of a crime, I am not obligated to present ID." Carter's smirk dropped. He wasn't used to pushback. "Sir, step outside with us," Carter ordered, already moving to block James' exit. James held his ground. "No, officer. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be harassed for standing up for these young men." Carter's hand twitched toward his belt. Not for his gun, but for his handcuffs. "Then you're resisting an officer's directive," Carter said coldly. "Which means you're under arrest." Before James could react, Carter grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back. "Whoa, wait." Mitchell hesitated, glancing around at the watching store customers. Even he could see this wasn't right. James grimaced but kept his voice level. "You're making a mistake, officer." Carter didn't care. He pushed James face first against the counter, tightening the cuffs as if expecting resistance. "Yeah," Carter sneered. "Tell it to the judge." James' expression didn't change. That's when he delivered the words that would change everything. "I intend to," he said calmly. "And I think you should know, the judge is my son." For the first time, Carter froze. Mitchell's eyes widened in realization. But the damage had already been done. James Holloway, the father of Judge Malcolm Holloway, one of the most feared judges in the city, had just been wrongfully arrested. And soon, the officers would realize they hadn't just picked the wrong man. They had set off a war. A judge's wrath and a father's silent strength. The air inside the patrol car was thick with tension as James Holloway sat in the back seat, his hands tightly cuffed. The hard metal dug into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. His expression remained composed, his sharp eyes studying every detail. The officer's movements, the radio chatter, the smug look on Carter's face. He had been in plenty of tough situations before, but this was different. This was personal. Officer Derek Mitchell sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his grip tightening around his knee. He was new to the force, and everything about this arrest felt wrong. His training had emphasized due process, de-escalation, and upholding the law. But tonight, he had watched Carter abuse his authority and arrest a man who had done nothing wrong. Carter, on the other hand, exuded an air of triumph, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel as he drove toward the 33rd Precinct, a station known as the Dungeon, a place where procedures were conveniently overlooked and misconduct went unchallenged. James Holloway was not a man easily intimidated. He had spent decades dismantling financial empires built on corruption. He had exposed police fraud, traced stolen government funds, and brought down high-profile officials who thought they were untouchable. He recognized intimidation tactics when he saw them. The only difference was that tonight, he was the target. And he knew exactly why. The dungeon and the game of power. As the car pulled into the gated lot of the 33rd Precinct, James mentally braced himself. He had spent years analyzing corruption in law enforcement, and he knew the tactics all too well. Delay phone calls, falsify paperwork, create missing records, and let accidents happen to those who don't comply. As they exited the vehicle, Carter yanked James forward roughly, but James held his footing, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. "Move it," "Old man," Carter sneered. James sighed. Predictable. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was cold and unfriendly. A few officers at the front desk glanced at James, but quickly looked away. They knew who he was. "Booking room is full," the desk sergeant mumbled. "Just put him in holding room 3 for now." James wasn't processed. No mugshot. No fingerprints. No official record of his arrest. This wasn't standard procedure. This was a power move. Carter led James down a dimly lit corridor and shoved him into holding room 3, a small windowless interrogation room with a metal chair bolted to the floor. James heard the click of the lock behind him. For the next few hours, he sat in silence. They were waiting for him to break, to grow anxious, to ask for favors. But James Holloway had spent years dealing with men like this. He would wait too. A son's fury. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Malcolm Holloway's phone buzzed violently on his desk. He was still at the courthouse, finishing up late paperwork when his assistant Eleanor Hayes stormed in, her face pale. "Judge, you need to see this." She handed him her phone, showing a blurry video from Wilson's store, his father being pushed against the counter, handcuffed, and dragged away by 2 officers. Malcolm's stomach twisted into knots. His father, a man who had spent his entire life fighting for justice, now humiliated and detained like a criminal. The temperature in the office seemed to drop as Malcolm took a slow, measured breath. He was known for keeping his composure in court, but this was different. Eleanor had never seen him like this. "Where is he?" Malcolm asked, his voice dangerously calm. 33rd Precinct, Eleanor said. "They haven't processed him. No charges filed. And the chief, Huxley, is involved." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Chief Huxley, the same man his father had nearly exposed years ago. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a setup. Malcolm grabbed his coat and phone. "Get my car ready. We're going now." Inside the holding room, back at the 33rd Precinct, James remained calm. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he knew one thing. His son would come for him. The door suddenly creaked open, and Carter entered with a smirk, followed by Chief Raymond Huxley himself. Huxley was a man in his late 50s, with a hard face and a smirk that reeked of overconfidence. He had survived years of corruption scandals, always one step ahead of exposure. And now he thought he had finally won. Well, James," Huxley said, mocking. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." James remained silent. Huxley pulled out a folder, flipping through it lazily. "I hear you were causing trouble again. Meddling in things you shouldn't be. That's a bad habit of yours, isn't it?" James held his gaze, unblinking. "I'm a concerned citizen exercising my rights, or is that illegal now?" Huxley chuckled. "We both know how this works, James. People like me, we stay in power. People like you either fall in line or disappear." James leaned forward slightly, his calm voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You should have thought twice before putting your hands on me," he said. Huxley scoffed. "And why is that?" James smiled slightly. The precinct doors suddenly burst open, and in walked Judge Malcolm Holloway. The turning point. The moment Judge Holloway stepped into the precinct, the entire room fell silent. Even the officers who weren't involved in his father's arrest stiffened, because everyone knew his reputation. He didn't just preside over cases, he ended careers. And tonight, his vengeance was ice cold. Malcolm marched straight to the desk sergeant. "My father. Where is he?" His tone allowed no argument. The sergeant swallowed hard, glancing at Huxley. Huxley stepped out of the hallway, fake confidence plastered on his face. "Judge Holloway, you shouldn't be here." Malcolm didn't even look at him. "I asked a question," he repeated. "Where is my father?" Huxley tried to keep his smirk, but he saw the fire in Malcolm's eyes. Then came Malcolm's final words that sent a shockwave through the room. "You are illegally detaining a U.S. citizen without charges, without processing, and without a phone call **** that ends now ***. Huxley paled. Carter took a step back, suddenly realizing how badly he had miscalculated. Malcolm turned to the officers who weren't involved in the corruption and gave a single order. "Get my father out of that room. Right now." And that's when everything changed. A son's judgment and a father's silence. The air inside the 33rd precinct felt like it had turned to ice the moment Judge Malcolm Holloway walked through those doors. Officers who had been laughing moments ago fell silent. Detectives who normally carried themselves with confidence suddenly avoided eye contact. Even the desk sergeant, who had been stalling James Holloway's phone call, suddenly became very interested in the stack of paperwork in front of him, because they all knew who Malcolm was. And worse, they knew what he was capable of. For the past 6 years, Malcolm had become one of the most feared federal judges in the state. He didn't just issue rulings. He dismantled corrupt institutions from the inside out. Politicians, corporate CEOs, law enforcement officials. If there was even a whiff of corruption, Malcolm dug until he found the truth. And now, the most powerful judge in town stood in the middle of a police station, not as a judge, but as a son. A son whose father had been dragged into this place in handcuffs. A son who was about to bring down a storm unlike anything these officers had ever seen before. The interrogation room standoff. Inside holding room 3, James Holloway remained completely calm. He was still handcuffed to the table, still seated in the cold, dimly lit room, as if he were nothing more than another troublemaker in the eyes of the police. Across from him, Chief Raymond Huxley stood, arms crossed, with a mocking smirk on his face. "You think your son's going to save you, James?" Huxley mused. "This isn't a courtroom. Here, I make the rules." James simply adjusted his posture, leaning forward slightly, his eyes sharp as ever. "Is that right?" James asked, voice calm. Huxley scoffed, pacing the room. "You've always had this annoying habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Writing reports, exposing things that should stay hidden. You act like you're a damn hero." James tilted his head slightly. "And you act like you're untouchable." Huxley leaned in close, lowering his voice. "You think your son scares me," he whispered. "You think his title makes any difference here. This is my house. The only way you leave is if I decide it." James let out a small, knowing chuckle. And then he said, just 3 words. "Turn around, Ray." Huxley frowned, turning toward the door, just as it swung open. And standing in the doorway was Judge Malcolm Holloway himself. Huxley barely had time to react before Malcolm strode into the room like he owned the place. His eyes flicked to his father, his expression unreadable, before slowly turning toward the man who had orchestrated this entire arrest. "Huxley," Malcolm said coolly. For the first time, Chief Huxley looked uncomfortable. "Judge Holloway," Huxley greeted, forcing a smile. "You really didn't need to come all the way down here. This is just a little misunderstanding." "No," Malcolm interrupted, stepping right up to the chief. "This is an illegal detainment. My father has been held without cause, without charges, and without a phone call. And I want to know why." Huxley opened his mouth, but Malcolm didn't give him the chance. Furthermore, Malcolm continued, his voice razor-sharp, "I want every single officer involved in this situation to hand over their badge numbers right now, because I'm filing a formal civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice." Huxley's fake smile vanished. "You wouldn't," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm's expression remained stone cold. "Watch me." Power plays and desperation. The room turned dead silent. For the first time that night, Huxley looked rattled. He had played this power game for years, framing people, planting evidence, controlling the narrative. He had gotten away with it dozens of times before. But this time, he had underestimated his target. And worse, he had underestimated the man's son. Malcolm took another step forward, towering over the police chief. "Here's how this is going to go," Malcolm said. Every word was an order, not a request. "You're going to uncuff my father. You're going to process his release immediately. And then you're going to pray to whatever higher power you believe in that I don't have every single officer in this precinct under federal investigation by sunrise." Huxley swallowed hard. He looked at Carter, then at Mitchell. Carter was pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. Mitchell, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. The desk sergeant, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from outside, suddenly stepped in, fumbling with his keys. I'll get the cuffs off him," he stammered, hurrying over to James. Huxley gritted his teeth but said nothing as James Holloway's wrists were finally freed. The moment the cuffs were off, Malcolm reached out and clasped his father's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Malcolm asked, his voice softer now. James stretched his wrists, nodding. "I'm fine," he said simply. But Malcolm wasn't finished. His rage hadn't been satisfied yet. He turned back to Huxley. "There will be consequences for this," Malcolm promised. "You have no idea what you've just done." Huxley forced himself to stand tall, trying to salvage his authority. "You really think you can take me down, Judge?" he sneered. "I have friends in high places." Malcolm gave him a slow, knowing smile. "So do I." And with that, he turned and walked his father out of the station, leaving behind a precinct full of officers who suddenly realized they had backed the wrong side. The aftermath. By morning, the story had exploded. Security footage had been leaked. Officers at the 33rd Precinct were placed under internal review. Huxley's long history of corruption began unraveling at an alarming rate. And at the center of it all, James Holloway sat in his home, drinking a quiet cup of coffee. Across from him, Malcolm watched the news reports roll in. "You're still going after them, aren't you?" James asked. Malcolm set down his phone. "They came for my father," Malcolm said. "They made it personal." James smiled slightly, shaking his head. "You were always the fighter," he said. Malcolm leaned back, his expression dark. "They thought they could get away with it," he muttered. James nodded, sipping his coffee. "They always do." Malcolm looked at his father, a knowing understanding passing between them. Not this time. This time, justice would be served, and Malcolm Holloway would make sure of it. The final verdict. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras flashing in a relentless pursuit of a headline. Lawyers murmured in hushed tones, sensing that today's ruling would be one for the history books. And at the very center of it all, Judge Malcolm Holloway sat high on the bench, staring down at the man who had once tried to destroy his father. Chief Raymond Huxley, now former Chief Huxley, sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together in a poor attempt to hide their trembling. Gone was the smug arrogance he had once displayed. The power he had wielded so mercilessly had been stripped from him, piece by piece. The once feared head of the 33rd Precinct was now just another disgraced man on trial. And today, justice would be served. A father's last words. In the front row, James Holloway sat quietly, his expression unreadable. It had been weeks since that night at the precinct, the night he had been dragged into custody, humiliated, and denied his rights. Since then, everything had unraveled for Huxley and his officers. The moment James had been released, Malcolm had set the wheels of justice in motion. Every corrupt action Huxley had taken, every case he had falsified, every officer he had shielded from punishment, it had all come to light. And now his fate rested in Malcolm's hands. James glanced at his son, his lips curving slightly at the corners. Malcolm had always been destined for this moment, and Huxley, for all his cruelty, had never stood a chance. The sentence. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Malcolm picked up the official ruling and began reading aloud. The evidence presented before this court has proven beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant, Raymond Huxley, engaged in a systematic abuse of power, knowingly violated civil rights, and obstructed justice for his own gain. Huxley gritted his teeth, refusing to meet Malcolm's gaze. Malcolm continued, "This court will not tolerate those who wield the law as a weapon against the very people they are meant to protect, and as such, I have no choice but to impose the maximum sentence allotted by law." The room erupted into gasps. Huxley's jaw dropped. His attorney jumped up in protest, but Malcolm's voice cut through the noise. "You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel slammed down. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Some gasped in shock. Others, especially those who had been victims of Huxley's corruption, nodded in quiet satisfaction. James exhaled softly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. It was over. A son's promise. As the courtroom emptied, James and Malcolm remained in their seats, watching as Huxley was escorted away in handcuffs, the same way James had been dragged into the precinct that night. It was poetic justice. James turned to his son. "I never wanted you to have to fight this battle," James admitted quietly. Malcolm met his father's gaze, his expression steady. "Neither did I," he said. "But the moment they put those cuffs on you, they made it my fight." James studied his son for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then it's a good thing they didn't know who they were messing with." A slow smile broke across Malcolm's face. "They never do," he said. The two men rose, walking out of the courtroom together, side by side, a father and son who had faced injustice and emerged victorious. Because in the end, power was not measured by a badge. It was measured by the truth. And today, the truth had won. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.